All right, I think we're probably good to get started. What do you guys think? Good? Everybody get some pizza, some drinks, and everything? All good? Nice. Cool. All right, well, welcome to Ithaca Web people. Yeah. A lot of regulars, a lot of familiar faces. This is Ithaca Web people hosted by Funkhaus as a venue, of course. Our beverage sponsor is, who is our beverage sponsor? Beth, help me out. Envision, thank you. Thank you. Envision is hiring. That's right. They've got, yeah, absolutely. Anybody that has any announcements to make, let's, get them out. That's awesome. Anyone else have any announcements or anything before we really get started? Anybody? Yes. That's right. If you're not on Slack, you should do that. Fairly active Slack channel. A lot of good memes in there, important. Cool. So also, as most of you probably know, we're going to start trying to record and stream these monthly moving forward. This is a bit of a test run, so we'll see how it goes. And also, we at Funkhaus are always looking for coworkers. If anyone is interested to come join us, we have a few open desks. Hit me up in the Slack channel or in my email, which you'll see in a minute, any of those things. All right, I'm going to just go ahead and get started, if that's cool. So today we're going to be talking about typography on the web. If you don't get this joke, you will in a second, hopefully, when I'm done talking to you about it. So basically our outline here is we're going to cover, we're going to start with the anatomy of a font, what kind of makes up a typeface, and some features that you may not be aware of. I'm sure everybody's worked with fonts before, but there's probably a lot of stuff in there that you don't know about. We are going to be, then part 2 is going to be going into basically specifically fonts on the web and how browsers interpret fonts and kind of the dance that happens there between the server and the browser to actually get the font, interpret it, load it. And then we will take a deep dive into what control we have over that process, techniques for sort of dealing with it, and then a bit of talk about performance. Yep, I broke this. Okay, about me. My name is John, for those that don't know me. I'm the head of Funkhaus Ithaca. I do my best to make the web a little bit prettier. You can find me at my email right there or at GitHub. So Funkhaus is a creative agency. We do a lot of very design-driven type work. Here in Ithaca, we are the sort of programming technological arm of that. And most of our work is very creatively driven, so it's these sort of font discussions, very important. We have an amazing design team in LA that does really great work, and it's our job to kind of breathe life into the site, but also to make sure that their vision is captured and everything stays intact. So this is sort of a thing that we deal with a lot. Also, on Ithaca Web people, we're sort of starting a drive to do more design type talk and be more inclusive of that, starting with Sanders' talk last month about SVGs and continuing on this month to typography. So it's going to be great. So let's get right into it. Let's talk about the anatomy of a font. What makes up a font? Well, a font is basically a collection of glyphs, and each glyph is a vector that represents a character. And so a glyph, or a vector being this type of thing right here, it's sort of like, if you remember Sanders' talk last month, the path object in an SVG, just sort of an arbitrary path of points and curves. That's what's going on here. Blue are points, red are control points of curves. So each single glyph is like that. Now those map to individual characters, Unicode characters. There's a lot of different things that go into it, but you can basically measure the weight of a font, or the size of it, is a factor of two variables. And so that's going to be the complexity of the paths. Each one of these points is a little piece of data that needs to go into the file, and the number of glyphs that we have in total. So ideally, we have a glyph for every single situation, every language, every weight, everything we want, but of course, you have to be careful. We have to use these responsibly, because in the web, you're going to be serving these to your users. So aside from just like one glyph to one character, there's a lot of other things that can happen with a font. This is the family Sharp Grotesque. This is a demonstration of Dropbox's new brand done by Collins Agency. This font has 7 different weights. Most of them are italic, and it has 21 different widths available. So that makes for a total of 249 different sort of combinations that you can do there. That's not to say 249 different glyphs, because if you imagine one single letter, like the letter S there, has 249 different ways to show it. Weights, widths, everything else. So when you get into actual glyphs, that's massive. You would never want to serve all of that to all of your users. That's not what Dropbox does, but this does give their design team a lot of flexibility in what they can do. Obviously, their text can fill a lot of space. For a more realistic example, Open Sans, one of the most popular web fonts, has 897 glyphs in it. Google Noto is another good example of a really heavy one. This is Google's project to solve fonts. It's trying to be every language, every weight, every a style, everything that you could do. You can see that if you download the whole thing, it's 1 gigabyte, so we want to serve that. So the point is, we have to be conscious of what we're serving, what's in our font, all that stuff. Cool. And aside from weights and styles and all of that stuff, there is a lot of other characters other than what's on the QWERTY keyboard. You can see that right here in the middle, the red area is basically a standard like Latin keyboard that we're used to. And everything else, this is one particular font face that carries all of this other extra data. These are other alphabets, these are Unicode characters, all kinds of stuff is in the font. So a lot of font designers, it's up to the designer for what they're actually going to include or not include. We'll have a lot of like extra icons you can see down here and this type of thing that's not necessarily Unicode, but is just like extra things because you have the space to do it. So some of them include it, some of them don't. It's different for every font. So like there's a big question of how can you figure out if you have a font, you're designing something or working with something, you need to know what is available. How do you do that? The answer to that is, at least in Mac, is Fontbook. It's pretty easy. This is FFmark. It's a Funkhaus favorite. If you just click on that tab right there, when you're in Fontbook and you're looking at a font, you will get a list of every single glyph in the entire typeface. On Windows, Character Map is the equivalent of this. And in Linux, I think it's Font Manager, but I'm not 100% sure. Someone may be able to answer that question. I just realized also that we want to have the questions going here like we did last time. I think that there was a question that was missed in the last talk. We'll try and sort of keep an eye on that since we have some people tuning in over the stream. Anyone streaming, don't use the YouTube chat. Try and use this little URL right here, and I will see it pop up and answer your question. OK, moving on. So character map. Also, Adobe InDesign will give you a lot of control to like inspect a font and go through all the glyphs. So that's how you find out what's in it. But in terms of features, there's a lot of extra hidden stuff that a designer could include in a font that is not necessarily obvious in the character map itself. We're talking about open type features here. OpenType is a protocol that was developed by Microsoft and has been widely adopted. It basically allows you to hold a lot of extra metadata in basically any of the fonts that we're using on the web, and you can manipulate these in CSS if you want to. Most of you probably would not have used a lot of these, but they exist, and if the font designer intended them to be there, you can actually tap into it. So there are tons of these. There's like hundreds. This is off of Microsoft's website of the spec, but we're not going to go into all of them. We're just going to talk about a few important ones. And again, each one is completely dependent on what the designer actually intended to be in the font. So first one is kerning. Kerning is adjusting the space between letters in a font, and specifically with letter combinations. So with no kerning, you can see here that letters are sort of like take up a set amount of space, and each one is spaced out in an arbitrary way. If the font designer has decided to add kerning to their font, it will look like this. You can see, for instance, the A, the V, and the A are, just by their shape, are naturally set up to kind of be closer together than the other letters. So kerning is contextual. The designer has said when an A and V are next to each other, please make them, a little bit closer. So there are ways to set this in the browser. Here's another example without kerning, with kerning. The red line is kind of like the division between two fonts. And then this down here is showing that we have some like negative space so that the letters are a little closer. It's subtle, but this matters. The way that you can work with it, this is sort of like a more legacy way to do it, but basically font feature setting gives us access to all of OpenType features that we'll be talking about. You just pass in a string of any of the different features. Text rendering is pretty well supported, and setting that to optimize legibility will allow the font to actually turn on the kerning, but also font feature setting will be current. There's a newer property that's also actually surprisingly well supported called font kerning. That has three options: auto, normal, none. Auto means let the browser decide, because sometimes maybe in a big heading, like a title, you want the kerning, big like display type thing, but in smaller, like body text, you might not want it because it might make it more legible to not have it. So auto will allow the browser to make that decision for you. Normal will force the kerning if the font has it. None will force no kerning, regardless if the font has it or not. But again, you may set that and see no change in your font at all, because it's completely up to the designer if they've actually like included that in the font or not. Manual kerning. What if you're not getting the kerning that you want and you have some changes that you want to make? What kind of control do you have on this in the web? Well, there's a library called Lettering.js. This will essentially, this is a jQuery plugin, but it will essentially just take some text and split it into a whole bunch of span tags. You can then have control either just by index or contextually between letters of the space between those. Kern.js is a library that sort of goes alongside it that is, it's actually, I think, like a browser extension that will allow you to visually do it. So you set up your title, you have this browser extension, it will let you drag and drop the letters, and then it'll give you the settings for Lettering.js. They go in hand, but they're a bit heavy, and there's a jQuery dependency, which I'm sure we're not all a huge fan of anymore. But that'll give you a lot of control. There's another option. This is what it kind of like makes it look like. It'll just like explode the word into like 1 million span characters, and then you can deal with it. Another option is Blast.js. This is made by Julian Shapiro, the guy that makes Velocity.js, which is the best animation library ever. Blast.js will just blast text apart, basically. That's all it does. It can do it by words, by sentences, but more importantly for our purposes, by characters, so that you could adjust this spacing. It also maintains JavaScript events, which is very important. Yes, Luke? What effect is this on screen readers? That's a good question. Screen readers. Span tags are, the thing about span tags is that they're specifically stylistically driven, right? So a span tag in markup is meant to just like be, we're inside paragraph text and I just want to make this one word red or something like that. So for the purposes of screen readers, they will sort of, if they're doing their job properly, they'll just kind of like read it as normal text, because a span is just inline. It knows that an H1 is the title, and then the spans are just whatever they are. So it'll just ignore those. Blast.js also, instead of doing it like this, Blast.js will also put ARIA attributes on the span tags and tell screen readers to basically ignore that as if it doesn't exist at all. So it's a good question. Cool. All right, so that is what you have over that. Next, I just want to quickly go through, remember we're still in these open type features. I want to cover a few more of those that might be relevant to you. So the next one is ligatures. Ligatures are basically, when you have two letters together. So you can see that in here, this FFI right here, the F and the F are just like almost touching, and also with the F and the I. This is really common for font designers to put these types of characters in there. These are standard ligatures. There's 3 types of ligatures I'm going to go over, but these ones are in a lot of fonts. Just basically merge the FL, the FF, the FI. So you have access to that. There are contextual ligatures. These are more like dependent on the font, but basically you can see that we have a nice, pretty swoopy font here going on. The designer has chosen that I and N should sort of do a cursive thing leading into each other, A-I-N, all that stuff. You can turn that on if it's enabled in the font. It will show up like that, before and after. And then finally, we have discretionary ligatures. These are just like fun embellishments that the designer may have chosen to use. You might want to use that on like a title or something like that. So that's ligatures. Then we have decorative features. My animations are out of order, but anyway. Basically, this one up here is swashes, so just like making letters a little more fancy. These are, again, really good for titles. This one is initials and finals, so that basically you can see here the I has this little swooshy thing, but when you turn that on, it doesn't have it because it will only apply it if it's the beginning or the end of the word. And then this one is titling alternative. So this is just basically completely like up to the designer of like things that you may want to have specifically if you're doing display style titles. Numbers, so there's like a lot of different options for numbers that this is actually really common. You may not know that this is in your font or not. This again is FF Mark, and this is just sort of done with CSS alone, sort of like cycling through different options here, but you can see that we start with normal text like that. We have tabular style text that will allow the text to line up if stacked on top of each other. We have old style numbers like that go below the line, sort of more similar to like the way things are handwritten. Semi-old style, and then /0, and then we have a completely different like styling alternative here with the circles, and that there's a whole thing to go into there. You can have styling alternatives, just like different presets, but that's sort of a different talk. But the point for our sake is that like you can have access to this stuff. Yeah. So yeah, so they are the same characters. So this is the same characters, 1 through 0 here. And that is, it's just, I haven't changed the actual text of it. These are the same exact Unicode characters, but the font has embedded different glyphs for it. So when you set those properties, it'll just switch out the glyphs for whatever you chose to use. And again, a lot of those features come contextually. So it's like you can target one span tag and do that if you want. And some of them are kind of like smart features. There's like superscript and subscript and caps and things that will only apply in a smart way. But yeah. So this is how you actually apply it. Not these actual properties aren't doing the text thing, but this is how the font feature settings works. So if you have interest in this and like knowing more about how this works, font feature settings is this thing to look up the spec there. Basically, it's a really interesting property, and they have a great like way of sort of dealing with setting multiple things because there's, like I said, hundreds of options, and we only have one property to set all of this stuff. Some of them, like Kerning, have their own special properties, but the rest of them are all kind of like grouped into this font feature settings. So there's a whole system of like inheriting here that we're not going to get super deep into. Yes?
How much of what, even up till now, how much should sort of put on a scale of continuum is design preference versus what you really like understandability versus what you think might look pretty is making it look prettier, right? Because looking at numbers is a huge difference. And I just wondered, is there some resource when it does come to sort of understandability that fonts are judged on, or is that always going to be a judgment call on point of
That's a really good question. I wouldn't think that there's a sort of like best practice. Actually, Tyler, do you know the answer to that? Depends on it's kind of discretionary, right? Right. So Tyler's a font designer, very, very talented. Look up his work, Tyler Fink. But yeah, he basically like it depends. I don't think that there's like sort of a standard, but a lot of the time like a designer, if you're a developer and you're working off of design files, there are some times when your designer may have intended old style numbers or something like that. Or like sort of like display, if you have like a big title, maybe swashes are appropriate, that type of stuff. I would make an argument that, well, kerning, the auto kerning thing is sort of a default in browsers, so a lot of the time you don't really have to deal with that. But yeah, I would just say case by case, and like there's probably more design logic that could be talked about in that I can't really speak to. From my perspective, it's sort of just like follow your designer's, expertise. Yes?
How much of this information can you see in the font manager program? So when you're looking at a glyph, like I see these, but if you're like, I just kind of downloaded this font from somewhere, how much can I find out and interrogate?
That is a perfect question. To go into my next slide, the answer is surprisingly unintuitive. And for those on the stream that probably didn't hear the question is, you have a font that maybe you downloaded from the internet. How do you know if these are supported? You obviously, who knows if it's like listed somewhere or something, you may have no idea where the font came from. How do you know what you can actually apply or not? The answer to that question, again, unintuitive. Basically, if you're using Typekit, the answer is very simple. This, if you use Typekit, is probably a very familiar window to you. You just click on this little question mark right here, and this is like a list of the supported open type features. So the ones in green are the ones that the font supports. So we can see that this font right here does support ligatures. That's something you can enable. It doesn't support all these other ones. That's only Typekit. Google, as far as I know, doesn't have an alternative for that if you're using Google Fonts. If you have locally installed fonts and you're trying to inspect them there, the best thing that I've found, and this is a bit random, but this is like a little app that basically will allow you to change any like typeface that you're using. If it's installed on your computer, it'll show up in this text. And then it has a list of like all of the most common of those like open type features that it will turn on and off in CSS. So you can just kind of tick through these boxes, and it will, if the text changes, if you see something change, that means that the font is actually built to do it. Any other way that I'm missing, Tyler, that you know how to inspect that? Oh, that's all right. They list open type features as well? Yeah. Got it. So that's good to know. So if you get them from Typekit or Google Fonts, there is a way to do it. If they're just locally installed, you pull them from somewhere, try and use this app, or try and like tap into it with CSS if you can kind of play with it that way. Does that answer the question? Is that good enough?
Yes.
Cool. Awesome. Okay, cool. So next, so that's everything. That's all I'm going to cover on open type and those features. This is how you find out about it. There's more that you can look into there. We don't have enough time today, but it's a good thing to know that it exists. Next, we're going to talk about sort of the types of different fonts and how browsers handle them. So what types of font files do we have? Well, there's like a million of them because everyone's got to have their own format. But fortunately, on the web, we don't care about almost any of them. Here are the types that we care about in order. Number one, WAF2. This is the newest compressed version of WAF. If your browser supports this, use it, right? Which means put it first in your list. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But this is the one that you want to use if the browser supports it. Not every browser supports it. Just WAF, Web Open Font Format. This is very widely supported. Probably has more support right now than most anything else. But some older browsers don't do it. So this WAF is just like WAF2, modern best practice, do that always. WAF, developed in 2009. Make sure that you do that, widespread support. TTF, TrueType, that was developed by Apple in the 80s, I think, but eventually was supported by Microsoft, so a lot of, sort of both sides do that. So that's your third property right there. And then EOT, this is Microsoft font, only Microsoft. Actually, only Internet Explorer uses EOT, but we have to use it anyway because people still use that program. Yeah, there is another one that you will probably see, SVG, as we talked about A font is just a set of glyphs, which are just vectors, so you could describe an entire font in an SVG if you want to, and there's a standard for doing that. It was never adopted by Internet Explorer or Firefox. Some other people adopted it but are sort of abandoning it, so for our purposes of this talk, we will never use it. You don't need to use it, it's 2018. But good to know that it exists. So yeah, now let's talk about how we actually load a font. In the early days, there was no loading of fonts. Basically, you were only able to use what was web safe, which is to say that you're only able to use what is installed on every machine and you know is installed on every machine, and you would just sort of declare them that way. Later on, we got the font face property. This, as far as I know, is absolutely the only way to tell a browser to load a font. There are other things you will have seen if you use Typekit or MyFonts or whatever, that maybe include this JavaScript code in the head of your document, whatever else. All of those end up just doing this one way or another in different fancy ways, so this is the thing that we care about. So we're going to walk through this a little bit. Basically, this happens in CSS. I'm sure most of you would have seen it before in one way or another. Font family basically functions as a logical group of different declarations. Each of these declarations basically are going to point to a set of files that tells the browser, here's where you find this font. And then we can group them together using this font family property. So you can see we're making two declarations here. Both of them are of the awesome font family. But they have different properties. So going through those properties, there's a few of those. You can define the font style as normal or italic, the font weight. There's 9 of those, but that's basically thin, bold, book, whatever you have. There's a much less used font stretch property that goes all the way from ultra thin to ultra expanded. And then finally the source descriptor, which is very important. And that basically is you set a prioritized list of locations where the browser can resolve that font. So you have two sort of directives in there that you can use at your disposal, and that's local or URL. Local will say, if it's installed locally, use that first. Don't try and get these files. If I find awesome font on this system, just go ahead and use that and never try and download anything. If you don't find it, then the first move is to go to this one, URL. That's an external resource that can point to a relative path here or an absolute path on some other server. And we'll try and download that and use that. If not, it goes to the next one, to the next, to the next. On that note, the format hint that you put in here is very important. The browser will not try and predict what type of font file it is and if it supports it. You have to use the format hint. So the format hint is optional. If you don't put it, it will still work. However, say that the browser, we do it this way, and our user doesn't have it installed locally, and the browser does not support WAF or WAF2, its process will be, okay, don't have it locally installed, WAF2, or whatever this URL is. I'm going to download that. I will read the type as WAF2, realize that I don't support WAF2, move on to the next one, download that, realize it's WAF, I don't support that, move on to the next one. So as far as performance is concerned, you really want to make sure that you can tell the browser ahead of time which format you're giving it. This down here is the Unicode range, also not super common to see, but this gives you a lot of power over actually what glyphs are being served in this font. Important note here is that the Unicode range, you don't actually need to declare this when you actually set the font. So when you do this type of thing, we're telling it, actually use this font now. And that is when it will actually try and load it. So when we call this, we don't need to tell it, use this font and use this Unicode range, because it will have already parsed the DOM. It knows what characters it needs. If all of the characters are contained in this set, it will only download these fonts. It will ignore these fonts. That's how it works. So that's really important. We'll talk about that for performance consequences later. But that basically gives you a way to split it up so you don't have to serve every single language in one set of files. Yes?
How does it deal with caching typically for second page load?
Yeah. Sorry, the question was?
Does it cache? Does it say,
Oh, yeah.
does it turn to local, or does it?
Yeah, so the answer to that is basically, well, it'll always follow this priority, right? So whether it has these files or not in the cache, the question was how does it deal with caching, for anyone that didn't hear. If it has it in the cache or not, it doesn't really matter for the sense of priority. It'll still go through these. It'll be at the point when it decides to download it or not that the cache will kick in. That cache is determined mostly by the server, sort of like what headers you've declared as like how long the browser should hold on. It's just like images or like any other resource, a JavaScript file. You know, the server is able to tell the browser like hold on to this for 3 weeks or something like that if that's what you want to do. And then if that's not set in the resource, browsers will have their own defaults of like, this is an image, I should hold on to it for X amount of time. This is a font, I should hold on to it for however long. So, yeah. Yes?
Will the browser, it'll automatically use the two different font files, like your top awesome font, your bottom awesome font?
Yeah.
For like mixed content that's like, you know, English and Japanese in the same paragraph?
Totally, yes. Yeah, yep, exactly. So if these could be, the question is if the browser will use these, if you have mixed Latin and Japanese in the same paragraph, will it use them? Yes. This is something we're going to talk about in a second, but basically the process of, it will not actually download anything. Even if you declare these, it will not download anything until it knows it has to use those fonts. When does that happen? It happens basically like after it has already, it'll parse the DOM, it'll realize that it has more CSS files to grab, it grabs the CSS files, it sees these declarations, but it does not download fonts yet. It will parse the CSS object model, compare that to the document object model, figure out how many of these declarations are there, because if I never declared it anywhere, it doesn't have to download anything, and it won't download anything unless I declare it. If I have declared it, then it knows it needs to download things. If it has these only Latin characters, it'll only download these. If it has these, it'll download both. We could include those, of course, in both one file, and it would treat it exactly the same way, or we could do it in 2 different files. And it should be able to deal with it just fine. In the same way that like you have so you have font face, you know, if this was declaring normal and this was declaring bold, and you had normal text and then bold text right next to each other in the same thing. Those are 2 different files, but it's merging them together because the whole thing makes up a logical group of a family, if that makes sense. Yeah. Here's how you actually declare it. So like I said, this is actually like going to tell the browser to download this thing and start using it. This, you provide a list of fallbacks, and it's really important to do that. So we're telling it use, you know, the font relative if it's available. If it doesn't have relative, fall back to Arial. If it doesn't have Arial, fall back to any sans serif font. Not any sans serif font, but the primary sans serif font on the machine is what it'll fall back to. We'll talk about this a little bit later. You want to be really smart about how you figure out what your fallbacks are, because that has consequences. Cool. So what happens when you try and set properties that don't exist on a font? So let's say that this is all the properties that you have, 100 to 900 as far as weights are concerned in a font. But say that we have only declared font face properties for 400, 700, and 900. Then I go in and I declare 100 ultra thin on a font. What does the browser do? It's going to round up basically to the nearest one or round down to whatever you're closest to. So it will serve you 400. What about italics? If you have a font, if I've declared this entire font but like have no italics files declared, the browser will synthesize the italics. It will try and make the font italicized itself. It also will sometimes try and make the font bold itself. That depends completely on the browser and everything that it tries to do. Here's a table of what that actually looks like in practice. So this, we have loaded, I think, Open Sans, only in regular weight, no italics. And then we have declared it, all these different weights and different styles. And the actual results are here, so you can see that we get really good, like ultra thin to black weights here. And then the synthesized results are here. So you can see that every single one of them does an italic, but there is a visible difference between the synthesized italic and the not synthesized italic, the actual one. You always want to use the actual one because that's what the designer intended. So try and not do this. You can also see that they actually do get a little bit bolder. Not crazy bold. You can see that this 800 is super bold, but not so much as this one. But the browser is actually adding its own weight to the font. So be aware of that. It's important. Try to avoid it. Cool. Font face, that whole property that we just talked about, is very well supported. It's been around since, I think, 2009. You don't have to worry about it. It's used everywhere. If you have a user that has a machine that doesn't support it, then who cares? They need to upgrade, right? I think that the only ones that don't at this point are like Opera Mini that's trying to make a decision to only include the features that it needs. Okay, cool. Other ways to load, as I said, there are no other ones, but you've probably come across, when you do it, you might have done it this way from a Google font, from Typekit, from My Fonts, from whatever else. There's a lot of advantages. There's different ways that these are handled if you just copy the code out and paste it into your document. This versus an actual font face declaration. So we're going to get into very in depth in the differences and techniques of how we could sort of deal with that. But I want to back up a little bit and talk about why we care so much about this whole process, right? We're going to talk a lot about the first bit of loading time in the browser, and it's very quick, and you have a lot of control over that process as a developer. You can declare everything, the order that things happen, how quickly they happen, and have a lot of control, but it's work, and it takes a lot of understanding of how this stuff actually works, and why does it matter? This comes from our very own Luke Jones. He has an article called The Designer's Guide to Perceived Performance. It's great. But this gets at what I'm trying to say here, which is all about perception of performance. There's an argument here that basically performance is not so much just in measurable speed, but in progressive enhancement and other things like that. So how quickly does a user see something? And what is their experience during that first seeing something? Are they getting flashes of white? Are they getting unstyled things? Are they getting invisible text, which can be really frustrating sometimes? This right here is just showing, sort of if things are under a second, they are perceived as instant. More than that, immediate, 2 to 5 seconds, point of abandonment, user will leave. We want to be really careful about not keeping users not seeing anything for too long most of the time. We want them to see what they're there for, which is content, of course. Content is king. There's a little bit of school of thought here on who's your audience and who you're actually targeting in what you want to prioritize. Most often, you probably want to get the user to see something sooner than later. Would recommend that article. So seeing something as soon as possible. There's sort of a whole newer thought process here on the critical path that we're not going to get into entirely because that's a bit of a different talk. But the point is, you want to show the user something as quickly as you can, and only the things that they care about. The thinking here is that even things that are scrolled down lower on the page that are sort of below the fold, we don't even care about. Things on other pages we don't care about. We want to show them the document and styles, and any JavaScript usually doesn't matter, but we want to show them something as styled, as finished as possible, as quickly as possible. If they're not going to see it, we don't care. There's lots of techniques to go into that. But that's kind of the thinking here. It's progressive enhancement, show them something. So this is what I was talking about before. The really important thing to understand here, this is just how a browser interprets a font, the whole process of it. It'll request a page, get some HTML back, build a DOM, a document object model out of that, realize in that DOM, oh, I have more external resources to load. I need to load CSS and JavaScript. These are blocking operations. That means that it can't render while it's downloading these. It still needs to wait a little bit longer. Once it gets responses from those, it can now build the CSS object model. And now it can cross-reference that with the DOM and see what's declared, what fonts do we need, run the JavaScript, build the DOM, render the page. The really important thing to understand here is that it is not until here, when it has the CSS object model and the DOM, that it knows what fonts it needs. So it is not until after it downloads these resources and has already done all of this work until it says, oh, now I'm going to start downloading the fonts that I need. That's why most commonly when you see flash of unstyled content, invisible text, whatever, it is font related, because that is very often, not the last thing. Images are the last thing, but one of the last things to come in. It's after all this stuff happens, so that's important. And we have some control over like how it handles that and what part of this process that it comes in. So that matters. This is what we're talking about here. This is a GIF of typewolf.com. So this is a progressive load. This is being heavily throttled by my browser. It doesn't normally just load like this. They're doing a pretty good job, but this illustrates the different steps here that we care about. So these are flash of invisible text, flash of unstyled content, and layout shift. So first one, flash of invisible text. That is this to this. First, we get no text at all. This, and then when we do get some text. This is often seen from a functionality standpoint as like the cardinal sin. You do not serve flash of unstyled or invisible text because if your user's on a slow connection, they can see this for multiple seconds at a time, and they're just there for the content. They don't care if you have a nice looking font or not. They just want to actually read the words. So getting this for an extended amount of time is not great. So that's flash of invisible text. Next is flash of unstyled content. This, if you're using an external font, is essentially unavoidable to some extent because if you think about it, you have everything rendered before your font. There's going to be some delay there. On a slow connection, there will always be some delay. So you can just do the best that you can. These look the same, but the difference here is that the font is not correct in this first one, and it is correct in the second one. If we look here, we can see that happen sort of like in this GIF. Right now we have the wrong font, and then the right one, right there, the right one comes in. So that is flash of unstyled content. And then finally, layout shift. That's when something is, this text right here is in a completely different place before and after something loads. This is the worst. I hate this. This drives me crazy. I hate it when websites do this. Because I might be reading something right here, and then suddenly your image decided to load, and now it's down here, and I can't read that anymore. So I think that this is the worst thing you can do, but that's a personal preference. So those are the three things that we're going to be talking about. And a little bit, you need to make some decisions on, like, pick your poison here. Like, which ones do you actually care about prioritizing, right? If you are the New York Times, you don't want flash of invisible text. Flash of unstyled content is probably okay because you need your users to see content no matter what. No matter what your site looks like, even if there's no style sheet, you probably want them to be able to read something because on really slow 2G connection on a phone somewhere in Thailand or whatever, you want users to be able to get to it. If you are building this weird Funkhaus website that is, sort of like for a film production company and is just all about having a weird experience and like communicating the idea of a brand, it's probably more important to you. There's not a lot of fonts in here, but the point I'm making is that like some interfaces will be like very important to execute exactly the way the designer intended, and maybe they don't care about slower connections seeing the wrong thing for 2 seconds. So you got to make a little bit of a decision there. Let's talk about techniques on how you have control over that. So this is how you might start importing a font if you're doing it from Google Fonts, similar on Typekit, whatever else. Again, these are just font face behind the scenes. These are just different ways of doing it. This is great, but again, if you just leave it as is, the defaults, and also same with font face, you can get some weird artifacts. And why is that? Well, because browsers choose to do it in different ways. And there's different ways that browsers actually interpret the fonts. Here's like, as far as I could tell, the most up-to-date chart that I could find on like how these things deal with it. So Chrome, Opera, Firefox have a 3-second period, a timeout period, meaning they will attempt to load your declared font, the external files, for 3 seconds before deciding that they're going to show the fallback at all. So during that time, you'll see invisible text. They do have a fallback, meaning that after the timeout period, they will switch to show the fallback font and then have an infinite loading period where they continue to try and download the font. If it ever actually comes in, they'll swap it out. Internet Explorer has 0 timeout, meaning that it will show the fallback immediately and then have an infinite fallback period, meaning that it will it will show the fallback and then at the same time try and download the font you actually want. And if it ever comes in, it'll swap it out. So you're way more likely to get flash of unstyled content there. Safari just does its best, God bless it, it's trying. There's no timeout, and everything else is not applicable because there's no timeout. So basically, it will show you invisible text and try to download the font that you want, and if it never gets that font, you will never see anything on the page. So if the server is down, you need to have a way of dealing with that. As far as I know, this is how Safari still handles it. Maybe not, but at the very least, some mobile versions of it do, some versions of it do. So it's really important that we need to take that into consideration. Devs have a little bit of control over this behavior in general. One of the ways that we have control over it is the font display property. So when you actually declare font face, you have this property that's excellent called font display that takes a little bit of control of that. But to understand it, we need to break down the process of loading the font into 3 steps. So there's 3 pieces of the action of the browser actually downloading and interpreting the font. The first is the block period. The block period is where it has a timeout. Most browsers will do 3 seconds. 3 seconds for this, like we saw a minute ago. That is where it will take the fallback text. It will basically paint all of your words in the fallback text, but do it in invisible ink. So you will not see the text, but it will be taking up the space that it's supposed to take up according to the fallback. And it will be trying to download the font during that time. It has a timeout, so if this is 3 seconds, if we get to the end of this, 3 seconds, and it still does not have the font yet, we enter the swap period. The swap period is where it will now show the fallback, so it's not invisible anymore. It is continuing to download your font. Most browsers, again, this is infinite, so it will continue to download this, try and download this forever. If it ever gets your font, if it's 30 seconds in the future and your font finally loads, it will switch out the fallback for the proper font. If there is a timeout on the swap period, or if the font 404s, it will enter the failure period, or if the browser can't interpret the font, meaning that you'll just see the fallback. You're not going to ever see the font that we actually intended. So these are the 3 pieces. Now, how does font display actually deal with these, use these 3 pieces in different ways? So font display, let's see here. Yeah, font display has a bunch of different values. The first one is auto, which is like just let the browser do what it does. Again, most of the time this is 3-second block period, infinite swap period, no failure unless there's a problem. So that's called block. If you set it to block, that's exactly what font display block does. 3 seconds, block, infinite, swap, and then no failure, ideally. The second option is swap. Swap means 0 block time, meaning we will show the fallback font immediately, infinite swap. So that's kind of how Internet Explorer does it, right? It's 0, immediately show the fallback, start downloading the actual fonts, and if you ever get them, switch them out. Next option is fallback. This has a very, very small block period, so about 100 milliseconds, maybe less, and a swap period that is a few seconds. So it'll basically show invisible text for up to a couple hundred milliseconds. If it hasn't downloaded the font you want yet, it'll switch to swap period, continue trying to download that for a few more seconds. If it times out there, it will just go straight to failure, never show you the font you want. And finally, optional. This one is just like fill or kill. Like the font is great, but if we can't get it in 100 milliseconds, forget about it. It'll try and download your font 100 milliseconds later. If it doesn't have it, it just abandons it altogether and shows you the fallback. So this gives you a lot of control over how the browser is actually dealing with this. And that's it, right? We have font display. We don't need to worry about this anymore. We can just like set these properties, and everything is good. Except it has terrible support. So this is something that's coming in the future. You should understand it. You should know how it works. You should implement it because that will future-proof your sites. Think about the way you want these things to work and put it in there. However, it will, a lot of the time, not actually do anything for your users. So let's talk about a strategy for loading fonts asynchronously. This is the first one I want to cover. This is by Monica. I'm not going to attempt her last name, but this is a blog post that you should check out, and I'll give you a way. You can find the slides, the link to the slides that I have here, by the way, at ithacawebpeople.com on the sort of like newest, the page for this event. You click on this event, and there's a link to the slides in there. So you can get to all the links and stuff through that. So this is a really great article just about like fonts and that type of thing. This is a strategy that she argues here is is worth doing. This is, if you care about fallbacks and your users and like nothing else, you just want to show the font as quickly as possible, you might try this option. So we're declaring the fallback font here on the body, and then document onload, we actually start loading the font, right? So, or sorry, we're actually declaring the font that we want and the fallback, but since there's no font face declaration yet, the browser has nothing to download. So on page load, or on document ready rather, it'll go straight to the fallback. And then on body load, once everything, images, literally everything else comes in, now it will actually give it the files for the fonts. The browser will actually run it and do that. This load font function right here can be done a couple of different ways. Here's one way to do it. This is just making a style sheet, injecting that into the head. This will block your paint operation. So this is important to know that it will now start downloading, and if there's other stuff going on in your app or your website during this time, it's going to be kind of choppy because this is happening or might affect performance. So here's a better way to do it that's really ugly because it's a raw XHR request, and who does that? And so this will actually like download the font at its state, grab the declaration, not the font, it'll download the actual font face declarations, the style sheet of font face declarations, grab it at its location, inject it into a style tag in the head. This also is not ideal, again, because you're basically, keep in mind, you're forcing flash of unstyled content here because they're going to see the whole page load with the wrong font, and then you're going to like actually try and show them the correct one. So I think we can do a little bit better. This is the web font loader. This is made by both Adobe and Google. It's a collaboration. Yes?
Quick question on the last one.
Yeah.
What happens on page 2 load? Do you always go through unstyled font, or will you have that cache because you're not downloading it via standard cache?
Good question. Not great, right? Because on page 2 load, you're going to go through another onload operation. It will show the wrong font again, even though your fonts are now cached. So you might, you'd have to do some extra logic of doing that. So yeah, it's not super pretty, but it is an option. It's kind of like font display optional, I guess, with the exception that font display optional would actually, on the second load, if it has the font, show it to you rather than doing that. It's a really good point. So this is created by Adobe and Google. It's a collaboration. It's got really good engineering. This is basically a high-level tool that tries to give you a standard API for like declaring fonts, and then gives you a lot of like extra stuff around it. So the way that this works is you might declare it like this. This is like an asynchronous way of declaring it, and we say, load a font from Google, load one from Typekit, load one from a local file that I tell you right here that's just a font face declaration. It gives you the same kind of API for loading all of them. You can see that we have this like shorthand notation for loading different weights of this family. Same thing that we're doing here on our like custom font file. You can only load certain weights if you want to. Even if you've declared multiple things, this will only load the weights that you're telling it to. On top of that, it will do this kind of thing where it'll give you a bunch of classes on HTML. This is saying for the font relative, this is web font relative, weight number 400 is now active. So until this class is there, the font is not active, and then when this is here, you can do some styling changes if you want to like hide things or whatever. It also has a bunch of JavaScript events and callbacks that you can tap into for all of the fonts. It handles them in a standard way. So it's really good. Gives you a lot of features. This is what we use most of the time at Funkhaus because it gives you so much control. It's really easy, and we load fonts from a lot of different places, and often we'll switch them out during the process when things change with the client or whatever else. So important to have that level of control. But for some people, this is not perfect because it's a little bit heavy. It has all kinds of support for like my fonts and like all kinds of other providers. Maybe you don't need that. And maybe it's not exactly work for your workflow. So here's another option. This is Font Face Observer. This is the website for it anyway. And Font Face Observer is a more like lower level sort of granular library. It's developed by one of the engineers at Adobe that works on the Typekit product. It works like this. Basically, step one, you just declare a font face like normal. Remember, the browser will not try and download the font just from this. You need to declare the font before it actually tries to download it. So by declaring font face, you haven't actually like told the browser to download it yet. Whether or not you declare it, if your JavaScript is loaded, you can now force load it like this. So you can say, new font face observer, I want to get output sans, load it. Whether I've declared it anywhere in my document or not, it will now load it and return a promise that's thenable, or if you're using async await, you can await that promise to finish. You can catch an error if it comes out of it, put a body class on it, deal with it in some type of graceful way. So if you have some sort of build process or something, like a newer modern way of dealing with JavaScript, this might be the thing that you want to use because you can just install it with NPM and just continue from there. It's great. The other thing that's great is that since it's a promise, if this JavaScript only boots up after it's already downloaded the font and everything, this promise will just return immediately, and that's what you wanted to happen anyway, so you can just kind of deal with that in whatever way you see fit. So that's a really good option. Might be good for you if that is what you're trying to do. So you can see a scenario where if you're using this font face observer, you could do this type of thing, right? So right now I have the font family Georgia as my fallback, and the main font that I want is Canella. In my JavaScript, I just say new font face observer, Canella. This will boot up whenever it has my JavaScript, but in the meantime, I can be sure that it's serving the fallback. I say, okay, now that JavaScript is booted, I want you to force to load that Canella. And now once that's done using the await API, this is a sort of pseudo-synchronous operation, so it won't get to this line until await is finished. Now we document body add class Canella loaded. Only on Canella loaded do we actually display the font. So this is like a more graceful way of doing that onload type of thing where we do it when the JavaScript boots up. We are guaranteed no flash of invisible text. We will have a flash of unstyled content based on the user's connection. So next, I want to talk about, just really quick, this is like the last thing. I know that this has been a long talk, but here's a quote from Jason Santa Maria. The thing I try to avoid most in my designs is not FOUC, flash of unstyled text, but a jarring shift in layout when a web font finishes loading. This shift is usually due to sizing discrepancies between your layout and system fonts and your web font. This guy gets me. Layout shift is the worst. So how do we actually try and avoid that? Because everything that we've talked about so far will not really help you with layout shift in the context of fonts, right? How they load in, you can hide things, but when you have a fallback font showing and then the proper font shows in, the way that your page is laid out might change. If that new font takes up more space because it's has wider letter spacing or whatever the case may be, things will now jump around on your page when you do that. How do you avoid that? So this is a process called fallback matching, and this is really important. Basically the idea here is that you declare your fallback and you want something that looks similar. Of course, ideally you want something that looks as similar as possible to the font you're actually trying to load. But more importantly, for layout shift reasons, you want something that is going to take up the exact same amount of space as the font you're actually trying to load. And so that kind of looks like this. You literally just lay two fonts right on top of each other. In this demonstration, we have Georgia and Merriweather. Merriweather is the font that we're trying to load. Georgia is our fallback. This is with no extra styling or anything, just do it as they are. You can see that one of them is not taking up as much space as the other one. We've got some overhang here. And more importantly, in this paragraph, one font ends here, and the other font ends the next line down, which means when the font actually loads in, the height of this will change, which could potentially push everything else on the page really quickly. So in this example, the after text, what we did here was in the fallback, and you would do this in combination with one of those font loaders using a body class and everything else to control the styles of the actual thing. But when you're displaying the fallback text, we've taken Georgia, remember, because we don't want to modify Merriweather. Merriweather is set to display exactly the way that we want it to display, so we need to alter Georgia to match Merriweather. So we take Georgia in this example, we increase the size 2 pixels, we increase the letter spacing by 0.1 pixels, and we shift the line height up 0.4 pixels from where it was, and we get this. And you can see that we get a really close match in spacing, and even in paragraph text, the lines there are really close, so there will be no layout shift. This looks like it's a pain to actually set up and do it, so here's a really great tool for doing that really quickly. Font Style Matcher, this again is by Monica, the same author as before. This will allow you to just declare 2 fonts that are on your system or download it in some other way. You drag these bars, and you can, there's a visual thing underneath here that I guess I'm not showing. That's like, this is actually a screenshot of what it looks like. Like this was actually taken from there. So it will just line up 2 paragraphs right on top of each other. And then you can drag these around until it's a perfect match. And it even will have a little checkbox that will sort of mimic flash of unstyled content for you. So that's a great tool for that. Lastly, last thing, talk about performance, just really quickly, one slide on this. What can we do about performance? Because everything that we've talked about so far really doesn't matter if the font was there instantly. So how can we get the font there faster? What can we do about that? Like we said before, correct order WAF2 first. Why? Because that is more compressed than any other font format. So that will just load faster. gzip everything. That's, it's 2018. We should be doing that. Browsers know how to deal with it. That'll make it smaller. It can go over the pipes, sort of faster. It's a great way to sort of speed that up. A CDN, it's a great option. Content Delivery Network, that'll make it a little bit faster if that's an option for you. Use the format hints because of the reasons that we talked about before to make sure your browser isn't trying over and over again unsuccessfully. Subsets, you can create subsets if you need to only support one language or not support all kinds of like Unicode Unicode characters. You can declare your Unicode ranges, break your font into subsets, and only use the things if the user actually needs them. Only load the fonts that the user actually needs. How do you make subsets? Here's a tool in the slides. This is a Python tool called Font Tools that will allow you to generate subsets. I think it's made by Google, actually, or supported by Google. That will allow you to break a font into like sort of multiple instances of itself. And then you can, like we talked about in FontFace before, sort of declare them separately and use them as you see fit. That's it. Here's some additional references. Check out these links if you have the slides. A lot more to dive into there that we sort of skipped over, but hopefully we covered a lot of it. Any questions? Thank you. Yes, over here.
How would your strategy change for progressive web apps? Caching, you use the file as a cacheable resource in your app shell?
Yeah, so the question is, how would your process change if you're doing progressive web apps? So progressive web apps meaning only client rendered, or like sort of things that I guess like you serve just the essentials first and then fill in the rest later, like that kind of idea?
You want to load the shell, but you want something to display. You don't want fonts to be, if you offline, you still want things to show up.
Right. Yeah, so I guess that the answer to that is just sort of like doing it in a way that, you can, that strategy that I mentioned before, that's kind of like you put the font declarations like as high up as you can, but you don't, maybe you want them to load sooner or later, so you might use something that's going to say like maybe only after my, the ideal scenario there is that the server will serve, something that's kind of like styles and markup that's like everything that you need immediately to see something, right? And use the fallback fonts there. Then maybe when your app actually, the JavaScript boots up and everything else starts going, you might in there have some logic to use FontFace Observer or something else to actually say, okay, now let's start doing the things that we care about from a design standpoint. Let's grab that other font, and then you can put a class really high up that will like reset the font, and then it can. Does that answer the question? Okay, all right, cool. Any other questions? Got it. Okay, cool. That makes sense. So yeah, again, on your server settings, you can sort of like declare how long you want it to hold on to it for. And if you're offline and your app does something to now make the browser realize that it needs to kick in a new font, if it's already sitting in your cache because of the server side, then great, but you want to definitely make sure during that time that it will not just hide the text if it actually doesn't have it, or at 404s or whatever else happens because there's no network connection. So, yeah. Yes?
Curious if you have any sort of like best practices that you guys do for like specific foundries you like
Yes, right.
Is there a certain, I don't know, just like guidelines you guys try to follow?
That's a really good question. So the question is like, do we have a set of guidelines that we follow when we're doing this in practice about where the fonts come from in terms of like foundries, licensing? My answer to that, some of our designers would have more insight on that. But my answer to that is that it's kind of the Wild West, and like foundries handle it in all different ways. If you can, my sort of thinking on here is that like if you can get a hold of the fonts, host them yourself, and font face them in, and then do some of these strategies to just make sure that your fallbacks are set correctly, that's maybe as good as you can do it if you don't trust the foundry or like the hosting location. I personally would really only like truly trust Google Fonts and Typekit to really host that stuff, because those are really good CDNs. They don't go down only because those companies are able to do that. So if you can host them there, do it. I think most places will allow you to just download it and host the font on your own server if you want to. Or you can always just download it. You know what I mean? Like that's what it's doing anyway. The browser's going to do that one way or another. It's going to download those files either way and get them, so you could just get them that way if it's sort of forcing you. If you're in that situation, probably just, I don't know. It's not great. But yeah, so if that answers the question, I would say self-host or utilize Google or Typekit or some trusted service and try and have control over it, which again, the web font loader is really great for having a lot of control over it, even if it's on another server. Yes?
One performance benefit that I kind of dug into around this is if you're self-hosting, your browser is already connected to that server to download HTML or whatever, so you can just download the fonts a little quicker. Specifically nice if you've got like a weird font, right? Otherwise, if you're on Google or Typekit and it's like your basic font editor in the world, always all your uses on one browser, they might already have local cache, so then that's the benefit. So there's
Yeah.
a bit of a trade-off, but you're also like super optimizing at that point. So
Totally. Yeah, that's a really good. Yeah, that's a really great point. So for anyone that didn't hear, Ben is just saying that if you use Google Fonts or maybe Typekit or something, then the style sheet that it's pointing to and the fonts that the browser will actually download may have already been declared in that browser by another website, and it might already have a cache for it. So that is a huge advantage. And then again, I think you said that if you're downloading from the same server, there's an advantage because you already have a line open with that server.
Weird font that maybe not a lot of other sites are using.
Yeah.
You have it self-hosted. The browser's already made a connection over to you.
Right.
Set up that connection takes time to set up and go back and forth and whatever. So
Yeah.
that can be a little faster to download than having to set up another connection over to Google. But
Yeah. Although.
Again, this really only starts mattering when you're talking about like 2G, like really
Yeah.
connections where you're gonna have a lot of latency just to set up that connection.
Right, which matters, of course, but then also, a counterpoint to that would be that if it's on another server, then your server isn't doing the work of actually serving the fonts. At the same time, you have the work kind of spread out across Google Typekit, and then the page is being dealt by your server. So. Right, totally. Cool. Yes? I do not know the answer to that question, sorry. Does anyone know the answer? HTTP2, can you push the font to the browser, and would that be useful?
You could. Very few things I'm aware of are good at pushing server-side caching HTTP2.
Right.
If you wanted to set that all up, you could do that.
Yeah, okay, yep. Cool. All right, so I think we're gonna take maybe a quick break. Do we have time for that? Beth, I don't know how long your talk is, but do we have time for a break, or what do you want to do? Okay, we'll do a real short break, and then we're going to hear from Beth Watson about net neutrality.
All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everybody. My name is Beth Watson. I'm a software developer here in Ithaca, New York. And tonight I have the pleasure of talking with you about something that I've been pretty passionate about the last couple months at least, and that thing is net neutrality. I think most of us here are involved in the tech scene, probably, if you're at a web meetup. So maybe you've heard a little bit of something about net neutrality. There's been a lot of happenings going on in the last several months, and tonight I look forward to discussing that with you. First thing we're going to do is define net neutrality, because honestly, it is kind of confusing. We're going to address some common misconceptions like, is net neutrality dead? Then we're going to go a little bit into the current state of net neutrality and internet regulations, what's happening right now, before diving into how we got to that point. We're going to go into a little bit of the history of net neutrality and internet regulations. Going to touch a little bit on what might happen with net neutrality in the future before finally ending on what we as citizens and tech enthusiasts can do to influence the future of net neutrality. So let's dive right in. What does net neutrality mean? I know as much as a year ago, I had no idea. I, for a while, thought that I was against net neutrality. I didn't know what it meant. So I think it's really important to define it. First part might be a little bit intuitive. Net, internet. You've got network. And what is the internet if not a network of computers hooked together, a network of people connected together? Then if we just think about the more traditional definition of neutrality, meaning impartiality, meaning when faced with conflict, you don't side with one side or the other. You're neutral. Put those two things together, and net neutrality is a fundamental principle of the internet. It means users have equal opportunity for access to content. They can put content out there and expect other users to have equal access to that content. And a really pivotal part of net neutrality is that ISPs, internet service providers, remain unbiased in their delivery and distribution of that content. If users put their content out on the internet, hoping that anybody who wants to see it might see it, it doesn't matter if the ISPs aren't unbiased. If the ISPs are directing traffic where they want it to go, those ISPs can influence the quality of that equality. Net neutrality is a principle of equality and freedom to choose what you see, hear, and read online. If you've heard anything about net neutrality in the last couple months, you might have heard net neutrality is dead. I think this is one of the most dangerous misconceptions going on with net neutrality right now, because net neutrality is not dead. Maybe it's in the ICU, it's hooked up to some life-saving machines, but we haven't pulled the plug yet. It's still worth fighting for, and tonight I'm going to tell you what we need to do to ensure that net neutrality lives on. We need to ensure that we protect our free and open internet. And when it comes to free and open, that's another thing that I feel we really need to clarify. Free and open sounds good, it's punchy. I am in favor of a free and open internet. People on both sides of the net neutrality debate say this. Advocates of net neutrality say they are for free and open internet. People who want to repeal net neutrality regulations say that they are in favor of a free and open internet. And this is an issue of perspective. Personally, I'm in favor of net neutrality. When I say I want a free and open internet, I mean free as in free speech. I don't want anybody to tell me what I can and can't put online as long as it's legal. I don't want anybody to tell me what I can and can't read or see or access online as long as it's legal. When I say open, I mean unobstructed. I don't want anybody to make it more difficult for me to find the cat videos that I want to watch, to find the newspaper articles that I want to read. I want my freedom of speech online unobstructed, and I want to read your freedom of speech online unobstructed. Advocates of the repeal, typically telecommunication companies, when they say free and open, maybe they mean something a little different. Free as in they want the internet free from regulation. They want the freedom to initiate creative business practices that they feel will help grow their companies, make their investors happy. Open is a little harder for me to understand. Best I can do is they want an open internet as in open market, open to their new creative ideas. Today when I say free and open internet, I mean free speech and unobstructed access to it. The next misconception I want to address is that net neutrality enforcement is bad for business. This is one of the biggest misconceptions. Ajit Pai, the current FCC commissioner, cites a $3.6 billion decline in internet infrastructure investment between 2004 and 2016 as one of the main reasons he wants to repeal net neutrality, because net neutrality regulations were passed in 2015. In reality, you can make numbers say whatever you want. Independent analyses have not confirmed Ajit's claim about the $3.6 billion decline. And I've found statistics saying that, in fact, investment and booming businesses have only gone up since net neutrality has been codified. But I don't really want to trust those numbers because any wordsmith can make any numbers that they find say whatever they want. What I do trust is that internet service providers, they really want favor of their investors. And they have not identified to any of their investors that net neutrality is a risk factor for their business. Businesses need to reveal any kind of detriment, any risk that might bring the company down to their investors for those investors kind of give money to the company, and no ISP has done that yet. I think that's pretty telling. But again, it's all about perspective. Maybe when telecommunication companies say that net neutrality is bad for business, they mean that they're afraid that they're going to be regulated out of their creative business practices. Maybe they want to try new pricing schemes. They want to try new infrastructure layouts. And this is what they mean. But as part of the local tech community, somebody who has worked at startups, to me, net neutrality is just so important to protect business, to protect innovation. Large technology companies like Netflix and Facebook and Google, they are also in favor of net neutrality. They understand that if we give up the freedom of innovation and freedom of speech on the internet, the little guys could lose out. And that means bad things for new businesses and existing businesses alike. Another misconception: if net neutrality goes away for good, I'm going to pay more for internet access. Maybe, maybe not. It's hard to say. I don't really want to get too far into hypotheticals and dystopian pictures that we paint. It's a possibility that our internet prices might go up if net neutrality goes away. And in fact, this is how I explain net neutrality to some loved ones of mine who might not be very tech savvy, because it's a sticking point. It makes sense to most people. But a loss of net neutrality means so much more than possibly paying more for your internet access. Net neutrality is all about preventing large companies from creating and using loopholes that would allow them to censor what we see and hear online. And the internet, as it exists now, has been such an amazing thing. It's a huge avenue for freedom of speech. Anybody, regardless of their socioeconomic status, their class, their current education, just with an internet connection, they have equal access to the same educational resources. They can communicate with people from different cultures all over the world. They can choose what entertainment they enjoy on a Saturday night. They have access to the same job listings and the same really important assistance programs as everybody else. An open internet provides equal opportunity for the distribution of your creative endeavors. It encourages innovation via the sharing of ideas, via just making it so easy to put something out there, get feedback, and have an unobstructed flow of users check your business out. It provides equal opportunity for entrepreneurship and gives everybody from different socioeconomic levels just a chance to bootstrap themselves and achieve more in life if they want to. The final misconception I want to address: sometimes people say, hey, net neutrality has only been around for 5 or 10 years. This internet ecosystem that you are clinging to, this thing that you say is so great, has been around far longer than net neutrality. Why are you making such a big deal out of this? Things have been fine so far. Why do we suddenly need to get the government involved? Well, It's not true that net neutrality has only been around for 5 or 10 years. Maybe it's only been a buzzword, but it's been alive in principle since the very inception of the World Wide Web, as it was created by Tim Berners-Lee. World Wide Web, that www dot, was founded on the very principles of net neutrality in 1980s. And as for things being fine before we tried to protect this idea of net neutrality, there's documented evidence of telecommunication companies trying to take advantage of the lack of regulation before. And that's something we're going to get into when we talk about the history of internet regulation in a few moments. But right now, I want to talk about where we are with net neutrality. Right now, the FCC is trying to repeal net neutrality consumer protections. On February 27th, the Senate and the House Democrats have introduced a Congressional Review Act to try to overturn the FCC's repeal. It's going to get really easy to get into some double negatives here because we're trying to repeal a repeal. So I want to explain this a little bit. In last December, the FCC has successfully voted to repeal 2015 regulations that were passed to protect net neutrality. So right now, on the table, those are being repealed. This CRA, this Congressional Review Act, if it passes, it will block that repeal and bring the status quo back to where it was in 2015, where we decided that the internet was important enough to protect, same way that we do our water utilities and our electric utilities. Congress has 60 days to pass a vote on this CRA, 60 legislative days, and they only need a simple majority to pass. The Senate already has 50 out of the required 51 votes in favor of net neutrality to defend the net neutrality regulations. The House is a little further behind. They need 258 supporters in favor of net neutrality, and they only have 150. So we still have a lot of work to do, but net neutrality isn't dead yet. Right here, I just wanted to point out the politicians who introduced this CRA into the House. We have Mr. Markey, a Democrat from Massachusetts, Mr. Doyle, Democrat from Pennsylvania, Ms. Collins, a Republican from Maine, Ms. Pelosi, Democrat from California, and Mr. Schumer, Democrat from New York. We know where we are right now. We're on the brink of losing the regulations that keep our internet free and open, that protect our freedom of speech online. But how did we get here? Started way back in 1934 with the Communications Act. This was the act that gave the FCC the power to regulate interstate telecommunication services. Back then, that was just like telephones. In 1996, the Telecommunication Act gave the FCC the power to regulate the internet. This is the first time that the internet was recognized as sort of a service that could be regulated. In 2005, the Supreme Court decided that cable internet is an information service, and this is a really important distinction that would play a big part in the sort of legal battles that would happen over the next few years. Because the Communications Act gives the FCC the power to regulate telecommunication services. But now, the Supreme Court has decided that the internet is an information service. This is going to come into play later. Also in 2005, Comcast was discovered to have been secretly blocking and throttling traffic to services like BitTorrent. This is a direct violation of the principle of net neutrality. They're discriminating against the type of traffic they allow their users free access to. Madison River Communications, another telecommunications company, they defended the revenue that they earned from users paying to talk on their cell phone, cell phone plans. They used port blocking to prevent Vonage from transmitting voice calls over the internet. So to defend their revenue from regular voice calls, they prevented another service from transmitting voice calls over the internet. Another violation of the principle of net neutrality. In 2010, the FCC passed the Open Internet Order, and this dictated that ISPs must be more transparent in how they distribute their traffic. They need to make people very aware of their plans to throttle under certain conditions, to give some users different levels of access. And more importantly, it prohibited ISPs from outright blocking and discriminating against traffic. So those things that happened in 2005 with Comcast, officially a no-no. In 2010, Verizon, one of the largest telecommunication companies, they sued the FCC. They realized that the FCC is trying to regulate the internet, an information service, and they understand that the FCC's jurisdiction is only supposed to be under telecommunication services. So they sue, and the lawsuit is going to last for about 4 years. Also in 2010, some more telecommunication services, Windstream Communications and Paxfire, they were caught hijacking their users' search queries through Google and Bing and Yahoo and redirecting them through their own search engines. Another example of telecommunication companies violating the principles of net neutrality. In 2012, Verizon Wireless refused to allow their customers to use their smartphones, turn them into free Wi-Fi hotspots, going so far as to block 11 apps that enabled this functionality. That same year, AT&T, and some of you might remember this, AT&T attempted to disable FaceTime traffic on their network unless users paid for a more expensive mobile data plan, and that was shut down pretty quickly. 2014, Verizon's lawsuit against the FCC finally comes to a head, and the federal appeals judge agrees with them. He's like, yeah, you're right. The FCC does only have jurisdiction over telecommunication services. But he adds, you know, if we reclassified the internet as a telecommunication service, then I would be on the FCC's side. And that kind of brings us into 2015, when the internet is officially reclassified as a Title II public utility. And this puts it on the same playing field as those other utilities which are so vital to the way we live and breathe today: water, electricity, phone service. This was introduced by the commissioner at the time, Tom Wheeler, and he called these new rules his modernized version of Title II. The FCC committee voted along party lines, 3 Democrats, 2 Republicans, in favor of the new regulations. In 2016, all this time, the telecommunications companies and net neutrality dissenters were trying to beat back these 2015 regulations. But in 2016, the US Appeals Court upheld the net neutrality ruling, which is only solidifying kind of the political ecosystem that we had at the time, which agreed that the internet was a very important part of our lives and it deserved to be protected every bit as much as our water supplies and our electricity suppliers. And then came 2017, which is a tough year for a lot of reasons, but in particular, a tough year for net neutrality. In January, Ajit Pai was appointed FCC chairman. He made it very clear that he was very opposed to the Obama-era net neutrality regulations, and he had plans to dismantle them. In May, he submitted his Restoring Internet Freedom Order for review by the FCC, which would repeal those 2015 net neutrality rules. And in December of that year, just a couple months ago, the FCC confirmed their vote to officially repeal those net neutrality rules. And several news outlets declared that net neutrality is dead. But we know that's not true. We know we still have that CRA, and we know we still have a fighting chance to protect our right to a free and open internet. A recent poll suggests that 83% of Americans are in favor of net neutrality consumer protections. They're in favor of those 2015 regulations. We only need a simple majority for this CRA. 83% is more than a simple majority, so you'd think it'd be easy. Only 37% of congressmen openly support net neutrality protections. There's a pretty big discrepancy there between the will of the American people and the will of their elected officials. You'd think it'd be pretty simple, but something strange is going on. We touched at the beginning, touched on the idea that, free and open, that's being used by both sides. Net neutrality is a confusing topic. Maybe some of our lawmakers are just confused. Maybe they see free and open internet, restoring the Internet Freedom Act, and they're like, yeah, this sounds good. Maybe they don't understand what they're signing. Maybe it has something to do with the $101 million that telecommunication services have donated to political campaigns since 1989. Here we have a chart which I stole from The Verge. The y-axis at the very top is $2.8 million. The median contribution of telecommunication companies to a political candidate is about $105,000. John McCain holds the record for having been given the most money at about $2.5 million. He's the tallest bar right there. And somebody received about $15 from telecommunication companies. This isn't a partisan issue, though, despite what you might think. So Senator John McCain is a Republican from Arizona. He's that tallest bar. But we've got Senator Ed Markey in second place right here, a Democrat from Massachusetts. He's earned a little over $1.6 million. Representative Greg Walden is following short behind, a Republican from Oregon. And then finally right here, coming in at just like maybe 1.5 million, we have Representative Steny Hoyes, a Democrat from Maryland. This might explain a little bit of that discrepancy between the 83% and 37%. Clearly, telecommunication companies really, really don't want net neutrality regulations. But there's something perhaps a little more insidious going on here. Ajit Pai was very proud of the long review period he gave the American people when he decided he wanted to repeal net neutrality. He bragged about the amount of time that the new rules were available to the public. But then he also went on record saying that every comment in favor of net neutrality that was posted as a result of that long review period, it didn't matter to him. He ignored them. Unless you made a valid serious legal argument, he didn't care. Millions of words posted by American citizens in dissent of his decision, just completely ignored. But you know who he did listen to? Lots and lots of dead people. Over 2 million people, a lot of them dead ones, wrote in to support Ajit's repeal. They wrote in as anti-net neutrality supporters, and tons of them were dead, which is super fishy. And in fact, some district attorneys are currently investigating the FCC for a serious case of identity theft, identity fraud, as a result of some of these falsified comments that have come to light. So there's quite a few lawsuits in the FCC's future, and this brings us to where we're going. Suppose the CRA passes. If we get that simple majority within the next probably 50 or so days by now, that's great for net neutrality. The FCC will not be able to attempt to pass a similar rule without significant difficulty. It's part of how the CRA laws are written. The opposition can't just continually spam the same rule. They have to make significant changes, and there's going to be several roadblocks. But if the CRA passes, that doesn't mean that we can settle down. We still need to remain vigilant and fight for what we believe in. If the CRA fails, then the net neutrality consumer protections that were passed in 2015, those are successfully repealed. And unfortunately, it's going to be even more difficult for us to try to reinstate those consumer protections. Not impossible, but still very difficult. All this adds up to what can we do as citizens to try to defend our stance in net neutrality. I'm not going to assume you're in favor of net neutrality, but my bias is in favor. whether the CRA passes or fails, whether net neutrality is saved or we have to keep fighting for it for years, we need to stay vigilant. If anything kind of naughty or is going to happen, it's not going to happen immediately. Changes don't happen quickly, so we just need to be constantly on the lookout and just keep fighting. We need to stay informed. Net neutrality is a complicated subject, and if we get to the point where it becomes more and more difficult to find really valuable information, really accurate information, we're just going to need to look harder. And as tech professionals in this space, we are uniquely equipped, perhaps uniquely motivated. We have sort of a responsibility to try to inform those around us and help them understand the decisions that they may need to make in the future. But the most important thing that we need to do to help net neutrality, it's become clear over the past few years that our current representatives maybe aren't speaking up in our best interests. There's a big discrepancy, 83% versus 37%. So the best thing you can do moving forward is just get out there and vote. So that's the deal. Thanks.